Hey there, everybody. Eric here, your Learning Futurist. Let's talk about content moderation and through the lens of recent news of Elon Musk looking like he is going to be the owner, possibly, of Twitter. And he went on the TED stage recently. I'm a huge fan of TED, and most of you know, to get interviewed by Chris Anderson, the head of TED. And I found this interview very telling about a couple of things. A little bit of the ignorance on both players here about their knowledge of the nuances of content moderation and what a huge, difficult problem this is. And sort of a little bit of hypocrisy about, Elon talking about his own Twitter account, his followings and bots and algorithms, and Chris Anderson feeling like he's trying to draw or get a whiff of that sweet, sweet click and view ratios that Elon could bring to the TED stage. So, using this interview and what Elon Musk has said about him possibly at the helm of Twitter, let's talk about content moderation in all of its beautiful, deep nuance. Coming right up. Right. So, Chris Anderson, the head of TED, and Elon Musk get on the TED stage at near the end of TED Global in Vancouver this April in 2022 and had a discussion about several things. But a large portion of their talk was about the possibility of Elon Musk being at the helm of Twitter, owning Twitter, turning it into a private company, and what he'd like to do, why he's doing it, and what changes he'd like to make. And a lot of this is very telling of maybe both of his drive and the way he views the world, but how he doesn't quite seem to understand the complexities and the nuances around this issue, and seeing it through his own lens of being one of the kings of Twitter, commanding one of the biggest followings and being able to even manipulate markets and things like that. And his twist with the SEC over his tweets and things like that. He has a very special relationship with Twitter, and through basically almost like what Trump had, with a very cult following, with a large bot army that amplifies his tweets, a lot of copy accounts and things like that on Elon Musk, because it's such a big following and people seem to like and retweet and engage with him through this platform. So he's viewing it through that lens, so that very powerful tool lens. And at some point, you also think he is a visionary. He's wanting to go to Mars. He's trying to bring electric cars into full fruition. He's even got the Boring Company thing happening, trying to, really disrupt and innovate in many ways. And so a lot of people saw that concept, saw that way of thinking about, the Mars mission, going to Mars, or reinventing the energy consumption on the planet, and putting that thinking, that fresh thinking, that disruption towards social media. Other people were very frightened and disturbed, possibly, with the notion of a private person at the helm of Twitter that's really, with even his own account, is very nonchalant, not very careful with what he says and what he puts out into the world using Twitter. It's like a playground for him, basically. So let's go through and talk about some of the kind of quotes that came out of this. And what we see now is just some examples about how he kind of views Twitter, how he uses Twitter. It's like his hobby. He's on it constantly. He demands one of the top 3 or top 5 followers and engagement on Twitter. And so he talks about things like social media and how it should be free, and his ideas about free speech come out in this as well. But you see it in his Twitter account. I wasn't very familiar with his Twitter account. There's a lot of cool stuff on there from SpaceX and videos. So I might actually follow him in the future just because I'm really into that stuff. um, as a space geek. All right, so Chris Anderson goes up on the stage towards the end of TED. I had some friends actually in the audience here live, and they gave the impression that it was a good interview from mostly all of the people, well, just two, that I knew that were actually in the audience. And I was kind of struck by this because I was kind of got a general sense of ickiness and a little bit of hypocrisy on both sides of this. Because on one end, we have a billionaire that thinks that he can solve this massive, nuanced issue of polarization, hate speech, free speech, and algorithm, digital divide, all that stuff that's happening on social media these days with maybe his engineering clout or something. And then we have Chris Anderson here, who is running TED and, in my mind, understands that the TED bottom line is starting to dwindle. They suffered heavily under COVID, so they need more views, more clicks online to bolster their online revenue as an organization. And Elon is his way to try to get some of that. In my mind, at least part of it was that, in as I saw it. So that was a little bit icky on both sides because he really didn't push on these issues at all, and he really showed a little bit of ignorance himself when he asked about some of these issues. Right. All right. So let's dig into some of these um, quotes from both Elon and Chris Anderson. Right. One of the first ones. Well, I think it's really important. This is from Elon that there be an inclusive arena for free speech. Twitter has become the de facto town square. So it's really important that people have both the reality and the perception that they're able to speak freely within the bounds of the law. And one of the things that I believe Twitter should do is open source the algorithm, make any changes to people's tweets, and if they're emphasized or de-emphasized, that should be made apparent so that everyone can see the action that's been taken. So there's no sort of behind the scenes manipulation, either algorithmically or manually. So there is a whole lot to unpack here about what happens at Twitter, the rules that have slowly been built on all platforms like Facebook and Google and other social media platforms that slowly kind of put in rules about what can and can't be on their platforms. So the first thing here is the de facto town square. Twitter doesn't have all that much clout. It is huge because there are a few huge people on it. There are dedicated, hardcore fan people on Twitter. If you are really obsessed with one subject, Twitter is where you go to get that community, to find that community. It's not where a lot of people go just to keep in contact with their friends casually, like they might on Instagram or Facebook or whatever. So if you're a space nerd and you like one specific type of space, if you're an entrepreneur, you're going to go on and follow Elon Musk and see everything he does as well. Uh, so the de facto town square in this case is people that are, in these niches on, especially on Twitter. But overall, this is a kind of an overall umbrella concept when it comes to social media in general, because it has become the public private square kind of melding together, because you have these corporate interests, shareholder interest melding with public interest, individual interests, and the ideas of free speech and privacy and data collection are mixing and melding in very unusual and difficult ways. And it's hard for companies to make a balance, and usually they have to prioritize one over the other. Like, for example, Facebook prioritizing market um, cap and how many users they have, or other companies trying to manage that a little bit better, maybe like a DuckDuckGo, and changing their business models and the way that they approach advertising, etc. Right? Uh, there's another thing here, freely within the bounds of the law. And so if this is a lot of things that I find very irritating about how social media companies operate. And if the law is your baseline, if you're a company that says we didn't break the law, you can still do a lot of horrible stuff and do a lot of damage in the world. So to have that baseline in your mind that you were going to uphold the law, of course, you have to uphold the law. You don't have a choice in it. But even that is very nuanced because Twitter is a global phenomenon. They're not even allowed to be in China because it's the law there that they can't even exist. So if you're going to follow the law, are you going to say you can't exist anywhere else in the world? No. This is a also very nuanced and complicated issue just in itself. We need to make the algorithm transparent, and that is just not how this works. You cannot open source an algorithm, put it on online somewhere and let engineers look at it and then understand what's happening online. It just doesn't work that way. What you might be able to do, what he might be referencing here, is the rules that get put in place to make the algorithm make decisions. So we're going to take down this, we're going to leave this up. But still, there has to be a human involved. And also, algorithms get down to the individual level. So what you do and what your actions on Twitter, how they meld with that algorithm and manipulate the data that's shown to you is not the same as somebody else online. So it's very difficult to understand how these algorithms actually get manifested in your daily news feed compared to everybody else around you. So to open source this really is not helpful. And even to make clear decisions as to what gets amplified, what doesn't get amplified, what gets taken down is not an easy thing to do, as we'll probably try and do later on in this video. So yes, he wants to be more transparent, it seems, but that, and again, is a little bit difficult as well. When you make things transparent, you also allow the more nefarious players in social media take advantage of those rules and exploit them for, usually for profit or for clicks or whatever that might be. So there's also that as well. All right. Next thing Elon comes up to say, in my view, Twitter should match the laws of the country, and really there's an obligation to do that. Well, let's take a look at what the EU said just after hearing that. They wanted to remind Elon that the EU has new laws out, and they're upgrading their GDPR, their General Data Privacy and Rights, which is probably some of the best collection of laws in the world right now to protect individual users against a lot of stuff major corporations are doing, like Twitter online, to collect your data and exploit it for profit. Things like the right to be forgotten, to be able to take yourself off of Google's index and things like that happen in the EU, but don't happen much where else in the world. Here in the United States, a lot of that stuff doesn't happen. But here in Asia, in Japan and other Southeast Asian countries, there's a push-pull between what's happening in the United States, what's happening in Europe, and what's happening in China, and trying to navigate all of these other forces, these Goliaths, into how they see these companies interacting with the world is really pushing these countries and pulling these countries, these smaller countries, especially in Asia, in different ways. And it's manifesting itself in a spectrum of different types of ideas, different types of laws, different types of approaches, and different allegiances, mirroring or accepting or not accepting different approaches from those three big players, the EU, United States, and China. And so to say that you're going to follow the law, I don't know if that makes any sense, or you can even make that statement. Of course you're going to follow the law where you're at. But that means you have to fragment and follow the law in different places, in different ways. So you have a Twitter America, a Twitter EU, a Twitter um, Malaysia, whatever that might be. Or you have one Twitter, which, of course, as a shareholder, you want because then you can work at scale and try to adopt as many, a kind of like a common denominator of laws throughout the world. And that is not an easy thing to do. All right, let's go back to what Elon and Chris are saying in this interview. Chris comes on to say, but here's a challenge when it's nuanced between different things. So there's an incitement to violence. If that's not illegal, there's hate speech, which in some forms I hate speech is fine. I hate spinach. Yes, nuance in how we define hate speech, which this is a very push and pull kind of thing for companies as well. So, for example, Facebook, they have their shareholders. They want to attract people. They want eyeballs on the screen to sell advertising, to collect data, to exploit that data. So they need people's eyeballs on it all the time. That means they don't want to show you something that you disagree with or offends you in some way. Or if they do want to offend you, they want you to offend you in a way that makes you engage and keeps you on the platform. And so algorithms tend to amplify those things that make you stay, the engagement algorithm, sometimes it's called. So hate speech and different forms of it, different nuanced forms of it, are amplified in many ways with these algorithms. And so even though you might say hate speech is not good for the bottom line, in some ways, because people are going to get annoyed and advertisers might pull out, or you might lose a couple of dollars or a couple of users here and there. It also helps you in many ways because you're going to get more clicks, more engagement, and people are going to get that lizard part of your brain is going to get activated, and you are called to action by clicking like or sharing it or whatever that might be online more often from trying to play with the edge, not getting yourself banned, but making your speech just inflammatory enough to be online and be engaged, right? Even government agencies are saying in Australia, United States, saying that they have had to change the way that they put out, useful public announcements, information about, health and safety and privacy and all that stuff. Government agents are working to try and inform the public. They've had to change the way that they put out this information to make it a little more provocative, to make it a little more clickbaity, so they can actually get this important information out there. That is also a sign. So if you're going to have an algorithm, or you're going to try to make this balance, people are going to try and push on this balance even harder to, get the most out of that engagement algorithm, but at the same time not get banned. So this forces you to be even bigger and broader gray area, right? Because you have more people trying to push the boundaries or find loopholes or whatever that might be. So that's actually, I don't know, a decent point. But he goes on to say something that I kind of threw me back on. Right, so you can't incite people to violence, like direct incitement to violence. Like you can't do the equivalent of crying fire in a movie theater, for example. And that's not illegal. What that's referring to is as a Supreme Court case where someone was trying to put out leaflets about the draft for World War One, and a lot of lawmakers, and this went to the Supreme Court, said you can't say that. You can't tell people not to follow the draft. This is We're at war. If you don't get people into the draft, we don't draft people. This could be the end or something like that. And I'm sure there's different views and approaches to what was said around that time. But the gist of it is, somebody during this court case, somebody in the Supreme Court said that by putting speech out in the world, by putting out leaflets that opposed the draft during World War One, you were inequivalent, shouting fire in a crowded theater, telling everybody that, putting everybody in danger, which I don't think is a very good comparison to begin with. But legally, you can shout fire. You can say, especially online, people say uh, things that aren't true all the time, and sometimes even those myth truths or those exaggerations get more clicks and engagements than just the boring truth of things. So that is in no way something that's true that Chris Anderson said, and actually Elon Musk said, just agreed with it right away. Right. So what that is you're talking about if you incite imminent lawless action. If you tell somebody to do something illegal, like go riot and break into the National Capitol building, that is illegal. That is what you're doing. But saying fire, no, nope, not so much. And we have laws online to protect you from getting sued in many cases around that very concept. So, not quite on that. So when Elon was trying to wrap up and respond to a lot of this, he said, "Well, I think we should err on the side if in doubt." So he's trying to talk about these nuances just a little bit in one of those quotes I mentioned before, and let the speech exist is what he said. Um, he's starting to stutter a little bit because he's I think he's realizing in his mind that there's nothing he could say at this point that would be pleasing to everybody in the audience. You have to make some hard decisions here, probably in one way or another. So it's a gray area. I would say let the tweet exist, but obviously in the case where perhaps there's a lot of controversy around necessarily promote the tweet. So, I'm saying I'm not saying I have all the answers here. So even towards the end, when he's saying, he's very much a free speech absolutist, I think was one of the terms that was flying around here during this conversation. Even he, in this conversation, starts to realize that what is an absolutist and what can and can't. So, of course, you can't let everything exist on Twitter. That's just not possible. We have laws all over the books to protect people or protect um, your rights to not be able to say or put on the internet anything you want. So to say it's a gray area, yes, it is a gray area. And it's a huge gray area and it's a huge mess. If you'd like to maybe think about this in a broader context, one of the main missions that I have in my, I don't know, activities is trying to promote digital literacy. And I do that on one of my other channels. It's called Together Learning. And I made a bunch of courses and a bunch of videos to help educate the broader public on the basic fundamentals of understanding what you do online, like what you do when you Google something, what happens, and what the algorithm doing is and why you're getting the information you get when you Google something. Things like understanding media and how it's represented to you, and algorithms and things like that. Um, so if you're interested in perhaps leveling up your skills or maybe getting a little bit more knowledge about your basic literacy on how you're getting your information online or how to better represent yourself online or be more responsible citizen of the world online, I encourage you to go check that out at Together Learning or the YouTube channel or the website itself. I'll leave you with a case study that we also talked about on Together Learning, and I talk about it in some of the classes I teach at the university level. And this has to do with nudity on Facebook. This is a content moderation issue that is still unresolved and is still moving forward, and it's been argued back and forth and for many, many years already. So, pornography is not allowed on Facebook. It's against the law to put it where children can see it and can access it, even though we have other websites that have gotten around this. And so it's still very easy, of course, for anyone to see pornographic material. win the right context. But we have, so that's also what Elon said about the bottom line of the law, right? If the law is your bottom line, then you're going to probably find a way to allow pornography on Twitter. But you're not going to do that, right? You're going to have some sort of standard above the law to appease the broader public, which is the community on Twitter. And the same thing has happened on Facebook. So they didn't want to show nudity. They didn't want to be associated with pornography because they want families and children to be associated with Facebook, right? It's a place where people go to, get in touch with their family and friends. So they made the determination to take down all nudity and anything related to pornography. But even this got some pushback and got some nuance involved with it. So the Oversight Board, which is a board that got put together, I think in 2018, to kind of be the arbiters of what can and shouldn't be on Facebook. They said that showing nipples of women was a form of censorship because, for example, what about breast cancer survivors wanting to show or educate the world about what happens with breasts, or maybe how to give yourself a breast cancer exam or test, or a bunch of stuff around that. Also, people are proud about their newborn babies and wanting to show their baby perhaps breastfeeding. And that was also a women's issue being put forward. So a lot of people within the company and without the company put pressure on Facebook to allow certain types of nudity for women to be allowed. And they tried to, of course, put an algorithm against this, and it really messed things up. So here's an example of a picture of onions that got taken down by the AI because it was showing a breast, apparently, right? So this is not something you can AI away. And then we have an army of people, mostly in the Philippines and other countries where labor is slightly more inexpensive, that make very quick, rash decisions on what is available on Facebook when according to the current rules around nudity. And to trick the algorithm, people know that they want to, that sex sells and gets clicks and things like that. They'll put a baby into a photo with maybe some nudity and to try and trick the algorithm. So this is an arms race in many ways. Like I said, that concept of trying to push the edge, understanding the algorithm. So we need people to actually make these decisions. So now there's a warehouse of people in the Philippines somewhere that have to make decisions that a legal scholar should make and they have a couple of seconds to do it in each of these cases. So this, of course, is not an easy issue. And in this example, in class, I would ask you to go through the exercise of trying to be the moderator of a social media platform and think about where you might draw the line if you were making the rules. And then allow somebody else to examine those rules, perhaps somebody that you're talking to. If I were in a classroom, would be somebody or a group of students sitting next to you to push back on some of these. And you'll find that it's whatever rules you make, there's some exceptions. There are some things that you might want to switch about that particular rule. And that is the underlying issue about making algorithms to do this, because algorithms want to make snap decisions. It wants rules from which to follow in the representation of code. But speech and what is acceptable and what is not acceptable changes from day to day, and your people's mood and somebody's mood. And also from country to country, culture to culture. This is widely nuanced, as I keep saying again and again in this video. If you'd like to learn more, come on back to togetherlearning.com. I'd like to encourage you to put your comments into the bottom of this video or wherever you might be watching this so we can continue this conversation in a more thoughtful, meaningful way so we can make the internet a better place. Again, I'm Eric, your Learning Futurist. See you again in the next video. Thanks, guys. Bye.